First, I would say that there has to be a desire in one's heart to become a man of prayer. And for some people, they have that desire already, but others perhaps need to pray for that grace that I want to become a man of prayer. Because if the heart's desire isn't to become one of praying, then chances are I'm not going to pray. When in fact one has the desire then in one's heart, the next step is to actually begin praying. And this can take all sorts of forms, but the most important is that prayer is not seen primarily as a task, but rather prayer is about building a relationship with our God. Just like any friendship, if in fact I meet someone and I want to come to know that person better, I need to spend time with that individual. In the midst of the conversation that takes place between myself and this friend, I begin to learn new things about this other person. But what is also fascinating is that as I reveal myself to the other person, I begin to learn things about myself. So too in our relationship with God. How can we really grow in a relationship with God if in fact we do not spend time in prayer? And prayer is a conversation, building a relationship with God. The best example, of course, is Jesus himself. In the midst of his public ministry, we read in sacred scripture how many times Jesus ended up going away to a place by himself to pray to his Father in secret. If in fact the Son of God spends time to develop and nurture that relationship with his Father in prayer, would we not want to do the same? That first desire in the heart is to become a man of prayer, and then the second step is to begin actually praying. St. Thomas Aquinas, the great moral theologian of the 13th century, talks about habitus, or habit. A habit that is good is a virtue. Conversely, a habit that is evil is a vice. To develop a habit of prayer requires a repeated action. For someone who is beginning a life of prayer, the most important thing I can suggest is that the person has to develop the habit of prayer. And that requires a consistent time and a consistent place. Otherwise, it's just going to be a desire. But once, in fact, I make that heart's intention to pray a very important priority, then I need to set a time each day that I am going to commit to God. Oftentimes I hear people say, well, Father, I don't have time to pray. I suggest that that is not true. The truth is that God gives each of us 24 hours of time each day. That's 1,440 minutes of time. The question is, how do I choose to use the gift of time that God gives to me? If in fact I don't choose to use the gift of God's time to spend time with God in prayer, then it's my decision not to pray. It's not that I don't have enough time. Why is it that we find time to do the things that we want to do? So please don't use that as a justification saying, I don't have time. Now, to develop the habit of prayer, I suggest that one set a particular time each day and you make that as if it were an appointment with God. Remember, again, that Jesus spent time with prayer into his Father, and we do well to do the same, especially as a diocesan priest, because we do not live in religious community. I have worked with different priests in spiritual direction, and oftentimes the attitude is, well, I'll pray later. Well, later becomes later and later and later in the day, and then at the end of the day, I found I haven't spent any time in prayer with God. I suggest that the beginning of the day is the best time for prayer. Now, some people are not necessarily morning persons, but because our mind is not distracted by the interruptions and all the things that happen during the course of the day, the first time in prayer in the morning is often our time in which we are most apt to be able to listen to God. Remember the conversation in the Old Testament between Eli and Samuel. Samuel kept asking, thinking that Eli was calling him. And finally, when Eli recognized that it was the Lord who was calling him, he said, the next time the Lord calls, say, listen, Lord, for your servant is speaking. No, he doesn't say that. He says, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. In prayer, one of the most important pieces is that we don't constantly fill up the time with God speaking, but that we actually listen. But to be able to listen well, our mind needs to be attentive. And that's why I suggest that when one is beginning that time of prayer, it should be early in the morning while one is well rested, God willing, and able to listen to God speak. And to set that time and to do it consistently every day. One of the things, if you're discerning a vocation to the priesthood, that you will learn as a seminarian is to pray what is called the divine office, or the liturgy of the hours. The liturgy of the hours sets a rhythm during the course of the day, at the morning, at midday, in the afternoon, at the evening, and at night, by which we go again to the Lord in prayer. St. Francis de Sales, one of the great doctors of our church, says, "Do not become so involved in the work of the Lord that you forget the Lord of the work." Every time that we go back to prayer with God during the course of the day, we then remember that we're not doing the work for us, we're doing the work for the Lord, and it's the Lord who works through us. But if in fact we don't pray, then we separate ourselves from God and we begin to think that the work is ours. It's not. So to begin the life of prayer, the most important thing I suggest is that you set a time that you consistently will follow. Secondly, I suggest that you set a time that is attainable and reasonable. Some people start off way too big with the intentions of making a holy hour. Now, that is well and good, but if you've never done that before, you find yourself taking on more than you can handle, and it often leads to a despair. I can't do this, so you quit. Start rather with something that is reasonable and attainable, maybe 15 minutes, and continue to do that each day. And over the course of time, then you can add 5 or 10 more minutes. But that habit of prayer becomes the discipline. And the discipline is, again, not about a task, but about building a relationship with the Lord.